Let's start with prayer. We know that without it, we don't get anywhere. As Jesus said in the parable of the vine, without me, you can do nothing. So let's pray. Father, we know we need your Spirit to work in our hearts, our minds, our imaginations, if anything of importance for your kingdom and for our soul can happen. So we ask for that promised gift now in Christ's name. Amen. I'm sorry this is Zoom. What I would really like to do needs face-to-face. So what I'm doing in the next hour or so, 2 sessions, is a bit more simplified than I would really want to do, because I would like to stretch you more, but I don't dare to do that at the moment. I divide the talk into 2 parts. The first part is preserving your faith, and the second part is defending your faith. Because in both arenas, you're going to have to be efficient and prepared. Like me, most of you listening to me probably came from Christian homes where the Christian position was taken for granted and you accepted it from a child. Most of us coming from those backgrounds don't have conversion stories in the usual sense. We're persuaded to have them quite often by our churches. I was, but it wasn't the real thing. That was much more sophisticated than I realized. So I never disbelieved the gospel story, in the sense that I was an unusual little boy. I started reading history quite early, and I knew intuitively that all those horrible things that happened to Christians in the first 2 centuries must mean that it had really happened. You don't do that kind of thing and do it joyfully as they did if it didn't relate to something that was vital to your lives and had changed them dramatically. Something we can't imagine, because unless we were unfortunate enough to grow up in a pagan or post-Christian environment, and then conversion becomes an amazing thing. One of my good friends, sadly now dead, who, like me, came from a blue-collar background in the Midlands. He was in Derby, and his dad said, get out and earn some brass, lad, when he was 15. So took him out of school, started an apprentice electrician at Rolls-Royce. Fortunately, he had a good math teacher who said, David, you're smart, go to night school. Well, fortunately, Rolls is a good company too. They quickly realized this wasn't a normal apprentice electrician, and swiftly they moved him into the research division for the heat fluxes for nuclear engines. And it wasn't many years before he was leading that division, having got an external degree in mathematics from the University of London in about 4 years flat. He just took off. Everything he touched turned to gold. He ended up actually as personnel director for the whole of Rolls-Royce, but that's another story. However, Americans would come to look at the work Rolls was doing, and going around his section, they would be duly impressed and then say something like, Dr. Dawson, this is incredible work. And he would say, Mr. Dawson. He was a sort of inverted snob. He only had an undergraduate degree. Rolls, of course, was embarrassed and said, look, we'll pay for you to do a PhD. He said, excuse the language, he said, what the hell do I need a PhD for? I have to teach those guys how to do the job. And he refused. But he got 2 kids, and they persuaded him to do a 1-year program, a master's degree at least, at the Greenwich Royal Naval College. And he happened to move in a block of 6 apartments next to us. And he jokingly said later, you got meningitis so that I could become a Christian. Because that's what happened. I was off for that summer. He was so self-confident, and rightly so. He didn't need any help from anyone. He came home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He could have taught the course himself. But I was recovering from meningitis. We'd be sitting in the garden reading. We started talking, then we started playing chess. Then one day he came home and we were playing chess, and I got a very bad headache, which happens when you're recovering from meningitis. I said, David, I can't go on. I have to go in and lie down. He said, fine, I'll bring the chess set in and things. The next day when he came back, he said, you got any more books like the one you were reading yesterday? I said, oh, that's where it went. He said, I read it from cover to cover last night. You got any more books like that? Well, the book was a commentary on the book of Habakkuk. I don't know anybody else in the world who's got converted by a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, but Martin Lloyd-Jones's From Fear to Faith is an incredible little book. And I didn't realize that David was struggling. Everything he touched turned to gold, but he had a hole in his heart, the one described by Augustine in the first paragraph of the Confessions. And he came to church with me on Sunday. I didn't ask him, he asked whether he could come. He'd read Mere Christianity in the previous 3 days, and that was it. He was converted. He became a Christian without anybody interfering, really, except giving him a couple of books, and we went on talking. He said when he went back to Derby, he lived in a village outside Derby, he said it was as though I had new eyes. And he did have, of course. That's what happens with conversion. You see everything differently. He said the kids in the village were doing odd bits of vandalism. Then I realized there's no youth group, nothing for them to do, so he fixed that. He went back to his department in Rolls. He said, I realized I knew nothing about the people who work for me, so he fixed that. That's why in the end he became so good at it that he took over the whole Rolls-Royce personnel management. But what a lovely story. And note the very important, he can't describe what happens. He simply knows that what he read made so much sense, and then Christ entered into his life. That's it. The stats for us who come with less of a story to remember are not good. Most doctors go for a considerable, most Christian doctors go for a considerable period of time when they have no subjective sense of Christ in their lives. And our world is absolutely riddled with subjectivism at the moment. It's the problem. Lewis said it would be in his wonderful essay, The Poison of Subjectivism, written in the 60s. He saw what was coming. So even our churches have bought into this, and I'll explain a little bit of how I think that happened. But we go to church to feel better. But that's not a Christian idea. You go to church to be taught and to think better, which usually makes you feel awful. You'll feel good when you are obedient to what you've been taught. There's nothing in the New Testament that I know of that makes you responsible for how you feel. What you are responsible for is what you do with those feelings, and that's an act of thought. So every epistle, bunch of theology, are therefore get your mind straightened out, get a Christian mind, grow it, nourish it, work on it. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That's present continuous salvation day by day. So that's what we haven't been taught. I was fortunate when I went from a blue-collar background, the first person in my family, extended family, ever to go to university. I had no idea what it was about. I'd got a scholarship that I never applied for at school, and went to for secondary school, for high school. I went to one of the best schools in England, where Tolkien had gone a generation before me. An amazing education. Going to medical school was actually a come down intellectually, because the guys in my final year at high school, half of us became professors for certain, probably all of us, I don't know. But it was an incredibly smart group of kids who didn't realize that. So everybody was competitive, and they weren't too snobby about it because nobody won all the time. But it was a wonderful education. Fortunately, in my first Sunday in London, where I went to medical school, another student took me to hear a man called Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. I had never heard sermons like his. And he got to my head, not my heart. That was going to be a little while later. And if I was bored with him, I could go and listen to John Stott. That's an incredible education. In 5 years, in his Friday evening Bible reading, Martin Lloyd-Jones got through one chapter of Romans, and it was never boring. And he taught me that immediately, you don't have to be ashamed of your mind when you become a Christian. You don't have to park it at the door when you get to church. In fact, it's your job, if God has wakened that bit of you up, to change your whole church to a place that doesn't park its mind at the entrance. So that isn't what happens. So you've got a very high likelihood that you will think you're losing your faith. What you're losing is the subjectivity that our society is so obsessed with. The objectivity remains, and we'll say more about that in a moment or two. So I arrived at university, and I love science, and within weeks, the program had got to me without anybody mentioning what was happening. And in fact, the people who did it didn't realize what they were doing either. I was turned into a reductionist. I consider this to be the major problem that we face in the church at the moment. If we're going to get our kids through church, through school, and into life with their faith intact. And you've probably never heard it discussed and certainly don't know its history. But science is reductionism, good reductionism. But when you get somebody like our current Prime Minister saying the science is in, you know that he doesn't know any science for a start, because the science is never in. It's always provisional. Even Newton, after a 300-year run, was displaced. And a long run doesn't even prove you're right. The longest run in science was probably Ptolemy and his model of the cosmos, which was entirely wrong, but it was practically useful. And we've become so utilitarian in our ethics and in our lives that if it works, we don't fix it. And from the working point of view, we shouldn't, but we shouldn't be content. We should always be asking the question, is it true? Is this the end of the road? Have we got it right? And we don't do that. So reductionism in medicine is very easily described. When you call a patient not by their name, but by their disease, you've been reduced, and you are reducing the patient. I was fascinated by the physiology and biochemistry, and that's the way I looked at things. And it was going to be years before it was corrected. God is not in a hurry. He knows what he's doing. So reductionism, how did it come about? Well, the whole of our culture is the product of Greek and Hebrew thought modified by the church. No other culture has made a big contribution to it. The secularists who waffle on about the Enlightenment, which MacIntyre rightly calls an endarkenment, have no idea what they're talking about. So the Christian era was where slowly, again, as I will repeat, God is not in a hurry. The church grew, and particularly when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was the church that preserved culture in the Western world. As MacIntyre says in his famous book, After Virtue, the last line is, "We are waiting for a doubtless news from Benedict." Benedict gave structure to Christian leaders so that they could be better leaders. Again, I can't go into that at the moment, but if you're interested, the book to get hold of, I think, is Banner, A History of Christian Ethics. Brilliant little book, certainly one to have on your shelf. So what happened is, for a long while, the rules from the ancient Greeks, you explain things by knowing what they're made of, what ideas went into it, what skills were involved, and what the purpose of the whole exercise was, teleology. But we didn't get very far. I mean, going to the doctor had no impact on your life expectancy until the 1860s. Again, another talk to explain that, but not now. But that's the truth. The book to read there is David Wootton's Bad Choices, Bad Medicine, I think it's called, but it's a history of medicine, which is really brilliant. He's not a committed Christian. So what happened was that the learning of the Greeks got lost for a long while, then came back to us through the hands of the Arabs in North Africa and into Spain. And in the 12th century, 11th and 12th centuries, it came over the Pyrenees and into the Latin world of the West, which was wide open for it. In all the centuries that they cared for the work of Aristotle, apart from mathematics and some astronomy, the Muslims made little use of it. The one guy who tried to do it had to feign madness. The others usually got as far away from the mullahs as they could. So Cordoba in Spain was the intellectual high point of the so-called golden age of Islam. But once that learning came into the monasteries, which were turning into universities, the universities were a Christian, as we know them, were a Christian invention of the 12th century. And Thomas Aquinas integrated basically Aristotelian philosophy with the gospel, with the Bible. An incredible intellectual feat, which he never finished. And that's an interesting story too, which bears on something else we've already said. Thomas had a meeting with Christ in the chapel shortly before he died, a few weeks before. And in it, Christ said to him, "It is well done, Thomas, what do you wish?" And Thomas said, "Only you, O Lord." And he never wrote another word, having written every day all his life. And he referred to the greatest intellectual feat in 5 centuries as mere straw. But what he had done worried some people in the church, that it might destroy the faith of the humble poor. And the Bishop of Paris temporarily in 1277 actually banned the teaching of Thomas Aquinas and others. It didn't last long because it was too powerful. What he taught about logic was just too powerful. But since all the universities were controlled by the church through the local bishop, those under the Bishop of Paris had to obey, so they couldn't teach Aristotelian deductive logic. And so that's how inductive logic, in my view, came into existence. David Lindbergh was the first guy I heard talk about this. Inductive logic is when you start from particular things and get to the big. What Thomas was trying to do is start with God and get to the particulars of life. And the journey's too long. We always get lost on the way. But you can only do inductive reasoning if you believe there's order under the surface chaos of life, which is why missionaries going to pagan societies are surprised when what they do doesn't transmit. Because so much of what we do is our culture rather than our faith. And everything that comes out of the West has been built on inductive reasoning. But if you believe in evil spirits as an explanation for the world, and they're a pretty good one in Africa, then you will never do science, because evil spirits are local. So you can't expect an experiment done in one place to give the same answer in another. Only if you believe in a God of order underneath the surface of life can you do experiments. And of course they worked. The first real experiments were done in Merton College in the 14th century. The important point was that there was a man called Ockham who was there at the time, and they didn't understand what they were doing. They drew the first graph without realizing its power. That took time to develop. But Ockham was smart, and he realized that this new approach was going to be, if it worked, very powerful. But it might be difficult for the church. So he tried to help God out. You should never do that. He's better at it himself. But he pulled apart the things that we can appreciate with our senses and the things that we can't. The things that we can't, of course, are things like love and justice and truth and honor. Does that mean they're not real? They're not objective? Of course it doesn't. They're more objective, not less objective. The fact that we can't measure them is not a good way of getting the objective subjective distinction. So he said, we'll call those just names. Hence what became reductionism was initially called nominalism, names. And it went from Ockham to France, to Nicolas Resme and Buridan. Nicolas Resme was a bishop, and so he was smart. He actually wrote saying, as a calculating device, it's better to imagine the earth going around the sun than the other way around. It's easier to do the math. He didn't pretend that it was the way. He was a bishop. He knew that was a stretch too far. Copernicus went that far. He believed that it was going around the sun, the earth was going around the sun. Fortunately, he was protected from anything by dying. It took time for these ideas to get through. Now, Descartes to Bacon, I have to truncate a lot, but Francis Bacon looked at what was happening, and he changed the meaning of the word fact. He said, collect physical facts, make measurements. Now, up until that point, moral facts had been more important than physical facts. Lies and falsehood, honor, dishonor, those were real facts. And they were more important, but they couldn't be measured. They can only be narrated, if you like. And of course, What happened was when they started making measurements and collecting facts is the scientific age took off. So it had its genesis in 1277 at the latest, nothing to do with the Endarkenment. They try to claim it all the while. It's not theirs, it's ours. They owe us. They've had a lend-lease agreement on science for a long while. They need to recognize it, and hopefully they will in due course. But in the meantime, you need to know that, and you need to know how to think about it, and you've got to build your intellectual foundations. So within 100 years of Newton, we have Laplace saying to the French ruler at the time, when asked where God fitted into his science, he said, "Sire, I have no need of God to do physics." And that was true. But he couldn't have got to that point without the idea of God. The right thing to say is the church was not a perfect patron of science, but it was the only patron of science. Science based on experiment happened nowhere except in the Christian West. It never took off anywhere else. And we should be proud of that. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. And we should rub their nose in it every now and again. Do it by questions, though. So what are you going to do about your future? How are you going to be one of those who doesn't lose their way for 20 years like I did? You don't actually cease to believe because the story is true and it's got a hold of you in a way that is deeper than you really understand. And it has explanatory power for much of medicine that physical science will never have. So I think one thing you could do is read every now and again Psalm 73, because it's a description of this phenomenon. I think it's a psalm written in flashback. An old man is writing it, and he begins by saying, "As for me, my foot had well nigh slipped. I was in deep trouble." And he was in trouble because he was looking around. The world seemed to be full of pain and full of injustice. How could there be a God in charge? But then the turning points are two. The first one is, he said, if I say what I'm thinking at the moment to the people I grew up with who knew me as a child, they're going to be heartbroken. I can't say it. So it was actually courtesy, respect, and love that saved him from just saying, "I'm an atheist," which is the easy cop-out with very little explanatory power. But he didn't know what to do. Then he says a few verses later, "It wasn't until I went into the house of the Lord that I understood. They, the secularists, have their feet in slippery places. Oh, what a fool I've been. All I need is you, O Lord, and I know that afterward you will take me to glory." One of the first real clear statements of heaven in the scriptures, chronologically. Wonderful. Read the psalm many times until you can talk your way through it without looking at it, and practice courtesy towards those who have cared for you when you're young. Don't become arrogant, and trust the Lord. Now, why do we do this? We can't defend it. Why can't we defend it in the way that we would like to? Well, we want to be in charge all the while, and God says, no, you're not in charge. As Jesus said, without me, you can do nothing. But one of the things that comes out of this process that I've been trying to illustrate for you is what Polanyi and Newbigin call tacit knowledge. Don't try reading Polanyi yet. Read Newbigin first, Foolishness to the Greeks. But tacit knowledge is something that is important in medicine, and it's important in Christianity. I think it's the best way of talking about conversion. God doesn't allow us to say we made the choice. Forget that. That's nonsense. That's getting the cat and the mouse the wrong way round. God comes to us. We don't come to God. We wouldn't even know what to do without his help. The best example, of course, is Nicodemus, who in our terms was a professor, and he'd watched Jesus, and Jesus taught with an authority that he didn't have. So he went to see Jesus by night so that none of his confreres would know what he was doing, talking to this man with no education and who didn't follow the law in the way they wanted it to be followed, undermining their position, in other words. And Jesus gives him the greatest non-answer that I know of. Jesus knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted authority. And he says to him, you can't get to where you want to be from where you are now on your own. Wonderful. That's Irish, isn't it? So he says, unless you are born of the Spirit, you cannot comprehend the kingdom. The first step into the kingdom, God does to us. We give permission, so to speak. We're carried along with it. We don't resist it, or we in the end we don't resist it. We may resist on the way for fear and trembling, but it's something God does to us. I can't describe to you a mechanistic account of how I became a Christian, but the fact that I believe this story to be true is central to my life, and what other people think about that is up to them. But they can't call me stupid, because that story, when you look at the history, and this is where we're so bad, you guys, I was taught more history than you've been. Most of you are ahistorical, which is terrible, because when a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, when the history was forgotten, the Jews became slaves. We now have rulers who don't know the role of Christ in the Western world and the Western culture, and we will become slaves, or marginalized at least, if we don't get our act together. Polanyi was a very smart Hungarian, Jewish, non-practicing Jew, as far as I can find out. But in your age, in his 20s, he was doing chemistry, and he was writing to Einstein, who corresponded with him. He thought the guy was smart enough. And then, of course, in 1917, you don't know any dates, so it won't mean anything to you till I tell you that's the communist revolution in Russia happened. And Polanyi was in Hungary next door. He knew if this succeeded, Hungary was going to be blown away by Russia, just on sheer size. And he was worried about it. He went to a conference in Moscow and got to talk to the Soviet Minister of Science, and he asked him what Soviet science policy was going to be like, and he got the Marxist answer: the proletariat will tell the scientists what to do. Well, Polanyi knew that couldn't work. That will work for technological advance. You can tell people what you want polished up, what the next step is. But leading edge science is not like that. It's passionate. And people go on doing it until they get where they know they ought to be going, or they're convinced they got it wrong, which is more often the outcome. But I got out of bed for one protein for 25 years. I wouldn't get out for any other, because that protein fascinated me. Why? I don't know. The first time I heard about the phenomenon that it actually underlies, I was fascinated, and that gave me my scientific career. But tacit knowledge is things that you really know that you can't explain. Like when you're married, you could recognize your spouse from very minimal data, a footstep, a laugh, whatever. But other people couldn't recognize her that way. If you want to describe her to them, you have to do it more reductively, and we do. And thereby pass over the amazing fact that we know things without being able to describe them. Not being able to describe something doesn't mean you don't know it. Now, Polanyi became fascinated by this. Fortunately, he got out of Hungary just in time, went to Germany, which was stupid, but got out of there just in time to go to and end up in Manchester. He was fascinated by working class guys who, in those days, in the immediately post-war period where he was active, working class guys came home from their labors, and then after dinner, after supper, went out to their shed at the bottom of the garden and made amazing things. And Polanyi was fascinated by this phenomenon, which is deeply ingrained in Western culture. George Stephenson, who built the first functional steam engine, could neither read nor write at the age of 18, but he built a steam engine before he learned to read and write. That's tacit knowledge too. Didn't get it from anywhere else. But Polanyi discovered a man who made violins, and they were good violins because all the people from the Halley Orchestra bought them. I mean, the only person who can judge the quality of a violin is a violinist or a really good conductor. So let's presume you want to be a violin maker, and you go to this guy and say, I want to make violins. And he says, show me some of your work. And you look at your work and you say, in most cases, don't bother, you'll be wasting your time. Occasionally you might say, maybe it's possible. sweep the floor, make the tea, watch, and then the time comes and he'll give you a piece of valuable alpine pine to cut out. And then he says, give it to me. And he'll feel it and say, oh, this won't be a great violin. You've cut a bit too much off here. It won't balance. Or he'll say, just take a little bit more off there. It'll be better. He knows when he's made a good violin. He can't tell you how he does it. It's the same with surgery is a good example. If I go all over the world speaking, but if I get a bunch of doctors in any town and I can say to them, who is the best surgeon, the best internist in this place? I don't get random scattering of names. 2 or 3 names turn up in every category. And when you ask them, why is he the best? You know, he just is. Now, for surgery, it's easy. You go into the OR when they're operating, and some people are butchers, and others, the tissue planes fall apart in their hands. They have a feel for what they're doing. They don't even know how they do it. They just do it. That's tacit knowledge. Conversion is tacit knowledge. You can know things that you cannot measure. And you only have to say to, particularly women in this case, if a boyfriend deserts you, is the feeling of disloyalty that you have, is that just subjectivity or is there something real at stake? Of course, there's something real at stake. One of the big mistakes we're making at the moment is the disordering of good things. Currently, we're putting feeling above truth. That's very silly. You only have to think, the way I deal with it is because I enjoy teasing. I say to somebody who's got well into this sort of stuff, I say, imagine you coming to see me, and imagine I wasn't a surgeon, I was an internist, but let's imagine I'm a surgeon. And when we've finished our conversation, I say, well, you need an operation. I can do it tomorrow. This week I feel like using my left hand. That's all right, isn't it? It's not my dominant hand, but I like to have both hands in service. Are you going to accept that? No, you want the best that's available. You wouldn't accept it for a moment. You don't think that feelings always trump truth. In fact, truth usually in the end trumps loyalty and feeling for certain in the best environments. So Lewis wrote about this too, first and second things. The goods are not laid out like a smorgasbord. One of the other places where you've got to preserve your faith is when you're taught ethics. Ethics are taught in most places using what I call the Georgetown mantra, which is justice, which is autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence or non-malfeasance. I don't know anywhere where they teach that those things are ordered. They're not laid out like the smorgasbord. Which one's the most fundamental? Well, actually, I'm totally convinced that it's not doing evil, non-malfeasance. God, when he sets the Jews up in Deuteronomy in order to survive, doesn't start with fancy things like tolerance. He starts with a set of intolerances. Thou shalt not do these things. He doesn't give any reasons. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That should be enough for you. Now do what I say and you will flourish. Don't do it and you won't flourish. And that's what happened. So the negatives can be legislated, you see, but you can't legislate the positives. You can understand them. If you know what nastiness is, you know what kindness is by extrapolation. And a culture that is rooted in this story cherishes those good things, the beneficences, but recognizes it can't make them central. You can do whatever you do in your culture at the time to people who murder, but they're not going to murder anyone else, is the basic rule. So only when non-maleficence and beneficence is in place and you recognize it comes from God, can you actually have justice? Because justice without transcendence is not possible. Because if the judges have no one above them, they will inevitably be loyal to their own group, and that is not justice. And freedom, autonomy, is only safe when those other things are in place, as Lord Acton put it. Freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish. True freedom is to do what you ought. And that comes by submitting to a greater power. Love for the Christian is obedience to the law, to God, to Christ's teaching. If you love me, keep my commandments. Now, finally, in this bit at the beginning of preparing so that you can preserve your faith, remember that the questions of not only of justice, but also of how we deal with suffering, they cannot be answered from within this world. The animal kingdom is nature red in tooth and claw in so many ways. The answer is yet to be. Christ says, there are many things I would teach you, but you're not able to take them yet, but you will be able to. And justice is mine, I will repay, but in my time, not yours. These things will be explained, and Christians have a sense of that, and I'll come more to that in the second half.